open by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today. I'm on Gadigal land, and I welcome you wherever you may be joining us from. And I want to show my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that this land is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. So the community of practice for policy professionals moved to webinar-based events earlier in this year due to the impact of the pandemic, and we've had a terrific series, and in total we ran 11 webinars and we heard from a great range of people. The particular webinar was run, it was the first one that we did, and the recording failed to work, so we are rerunning it at the end of the year, which is good for me. I get to have another go. So firstly, I'll just introduce myself. My name's Louisa Mamuni. I have worked in policy and related areas of implementation for around 20 years for the New South Wales government, and I've also worked in local government and covered an area areas including environment, resources, and energy, housing policy, and planning. It's a very long list. Anyway, also economic policy and also programs. So anyway, that's a bit about me, and I'm currently the Director of Cabinet in Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. So it's great. Really, I'm glad that you could be with us today as well. Policy is always been really passionate about, and a few years ago I was on maternity leave actually for the first time, and felt like I had some spare time on my hands and thought, I know I'll do my my doctorate, my PhD, and I trotted off down to Canberra at ANU and commenced that work on policy. And the first thing that my supervisor said to me was that I had to work out my epistemology. How would I know what I believed in? You know, how would I know what I knew? And this how I know what was real or what was you know, or not real, in order to conform with an established school of thought. So after about 8 years of enduring some rather withering criticism and really feeling completely out of my depth, they did decide that I could pass, and now I have to admit that I don't know a lot of stuff about policy, but you remember the language that we adopted at the start of the pandemic about practicing social distancing. I think that's the way that I'm going to approach policy from now on. It's something that I'm practicing, and always thinking about what we can learn from observation and from others, from other fields, in order to understand what is going on in our world of policy. So I'm going to talk through a set of slides today, as the whole webinar is really designed as a bit of an introduction to how academics think about policy and the frameworks that they use. And some of those academics have come from government and moved into academia, and then used their new kind of environment to think about the experiences that they've had. So it's not all completely just academic thought, but it is mainly academic thought. And I wanted to really use this webinar as to start a conversation about policy, about its strengths, its limitations, and how we can improve it. And I hope that this is a theme that is explored through the Western webinar series, and you can check those out. They're also recorded. We'll circulate a link later. And of course, there's always next year too, to continue the conversation. We've heard this year from Shane Fitzsimmons, who was talking about the relationship between policy and implementation. We heard from Peter Shergold about policy failure. We heard about regulation from Scott Wheeler in Treasury. Most recently, we heard about Joanne Wilkie about how policy practitioners deal with crisis, and also Liz Livingston in pondering the future of policy as well, and the role of practitioners in that. So policy academics do lean a little bit towards oddball, I have to admit. Policy is really multidisciplinary from a start, so there's no neat fit for policy academics. They're often straddling, political science or other fields of arts or more traditional schools of study like health or science. But they just don't have the prestige as say economics or law. And from our perspective, academic policy analysis can seem a little off kilter compared to our well-honed skills in policy analysis. We're drilled in the expectations and limitations of government decision making. Our processes, means and decisions are usually closely guarded and protected by legislation, codes of practice and the cultural norms of working for government. So when academics look at policy, they are a little bit limited in terms of what they can see and understand. But whilst some academics are overly fond of their leather jackets and make a point of not sullying their reputation by truly getting too close to government, most of them turn out to be genuine, committed and very intelligent individuals, and sometimes a little bewildered. But we think, I think that they have some ideas worthy of our attention. So I'm now going to turn to my PowerPoint on, and I don't know, we'll kind of go through a normal presentation for 20 to 30 minutes, I think, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. I'll let you know how to do that when we get to that point. So if you just give me a moment, I'll load my presentation. Okay, that should be up for you to see. We've now covered this, and we'll start talking about what is policy. So I think we first need to kind of have a discussion about how we characterise policy. So policy can be the decisions that government makes, what government decides to do. But it can also be decisions that government chooses not to make. So these definitions both came from Dye, 1972. But what about the range of players that are operating in the policy world with their distinct concerns? This was an idea put forward by Colbatch in 2006. He argues, can we just say government and be satisfied with that understanding? What about implementation or the impact of policy? What about the stakeholders? Perhaps we have to have an understanding of the expectation of the outcomes as well. And as Friedrich pointed out in 1940, policy and its implementation can't be separated. So you might be more satisfied with a definition which looks something like Sharkansky's from 1972. Policy is the output of government decision makers interacting with the constraints of actors, structures and ideas at a given social and political conjuncture. So the normal way that we understand policy, I say normal, if you go to a policy course, they'll probably teach you something that looks a bit like this. And I hope that some of you are familiar with this type of concept. I've put one in here. Bridgman and who was then in Queensland Department of Premier and Cabinet, and Davis from Griffith University developed this as part of the Australian Policy Handbook. To help make sense, they said it was to help make sense of the policy process for the puzzled. And their latest editions are now authored by Catherine Outhouse. It was based on an idea, the policy cycle was based on an idea from Harold Laswell in 1951, but it was updated and made into a cycle, a non-linear approach. Howlett, Ramesh and Pearl have pointed out it doesn't have to be as complex as the one I've shown. It can be as simple as agenda setting, policy formulation, decision making, implementation and evaluation. So just 5 stages. It's intended really as a model, a heuristic or a shortcut to help in understanding. On the positive side of this, it is pretty easy to understand and follow. It's got a logical flow. It gives us language to explain and recognise and communicate the stages of the policy process. And it incorporates review, which is a good thing to do. And how we can use it to help make sense of the messy experience that we might have of policy, and it can help us plan the stages of our work as well. Let's look at how it might work in practice. So I took the policy cycle, the simplified one, and with 5 stages, and laid it against some of understanding of the NDIS, and to try and show how this policy cycle could be put into practice with an example. So it started off, the NDIS started off with a discussion of problems about disability support arrangements, and people were saying, you know, we're not getting the right type of support, government's choosing for us, you know, we want a greater range of choice. So that discussion started within the community, by disability advocates, by people who cared for disabled people and disabled people themselves. And New South Wales government worked with stakeholders on a vision for individualised and person-centred design. Then there was a bunch of other work that went on. So there was a Senate Standing Committee, the Australia 2020 Summit, National Disability Strategy, Disability Investment Group, and all of those kind of reviews and investigations were really part of the policy formulation. You know, how can we take this idea that has emerged on the policy agenda and make it into something that can be decided on? So the Productivity Commission as well finally kind of put that together 31st of July in 2011. Then the decision-making stage. So the Prime Minister announced the NDIS on the 10th of August 2011. I guess that's a decision of a type. We're going to do this, he said. We're, you know, I hope I've got the right Prime Minister. I think it actually may have been Julia Gillard, but anyway, that point escapes me right now. And COAG also committed, and there was a heads of agreement between the states and territories and the Commonwealth at the time. The next thing which is really interesting about the policy cycle is the implementation, and you can see here that there was a whole lot of work that went on in implementation. There was a Disability Reform Council, there were particular budget decisions. They did the quite significant trial before they were comfortable, before the government was comfortable to commit to expanding to the full scheme implementation. There was the establishment of the National Disability Insurance Agency, and there's legislation, of course. There was lots of, that was just the stuff really within government and outside of government. The disability services market was developing. Individual people who wanted to were part of the NDIS had to negotiate packages, and you'll probably remember lots of media about how that was going and some of the problems with that. And then lastly, there has been some evaluation. There were evaluation of the trials, but still we hear about problems emerging, and evaluation does tend to be a bit sporadic. So anyway, that gives you kind of a sense of if you want to apply the policy cycle to a particular example. Here's one that I've had a go at, and I think you could take a similar approach with any other policy that you're working on to try and kind of map out, you know, what are the stages of policy development, making and decision making, implementation and evaluation. But as with all good frameworks, there has been quite a bit of critique about it. Bridgman and and it's quite it really bogged down a lot of policy discussion between academics for quite some time. From an academic perspective, they said the policy cycle is a form of rationalism or positivism. That's a bad thing, apparently. I'll explain that later. It's erroneous, it's simplistic, it's process, not content. It doesn't tell us how difficult decisions are made. Practitioners said, well, the stages, they can be a bit unclear, they can be skipped. Not necessarily as sequential as it's presented in the cycle. And it may not, one policy doesn't then be reviewed and then necessarily lead into another policy. So it might not be cyclical at all. So quite a bit of criticism across the board. And I'll just explain this concept of rationalism and positivism in policy. So the idea of positivism is from Auguste Comte, who was an 18th or 19th century philosopher, that knowledge is based on data. It is what it is, and there is no room for exploration of why, how, or should. And really it was a reaction against the belief in supernatural forces. So I guess you could think of legal, you could align it to kind of the idea about legal positivism, which is black letter law, as opposed to what the law should be. If you're legally trained, that might be a way of understanding what positivism means in a policy context. So policy issues are identified as a consequence of rational evaluation of threats and policies problems under positivism. We try and make clear statements in precise quantitative terms to promote clear thinking about policy matters. And largely this is what we do within government today. We try and evaluate things, work out the sum of benefits accrued by individuals. This is really cost-benefit analysis type thinking. So a lot of the analytical techniques that we use are based in this idea of positivism. But as I said, there has been some critiques of it, and I think from an academic perspective, what they're saying is, well, actually policy is determined by political conflicts and compromises by various actors, Ingram and Mann, 1980. And positivism oversimplifies motivations of individuals and ignores the complexity of society, from Howlett, and it also masks the framing of policy decisions, the relationship between actors, activities and influences that shapes decisions and implementation and results. And as policy practitioners, you will know that ministers, either alone or collectively in cabinet, are expected to make quite value-laden judgments based on their political experience and connection with constituents. It's not just the sum of the benefits, therefore we should make this policy or not make this policy. There are a lot more complexity where those value judgments are made. The other problem with positivism is that some aspects of policy can be really hard to quantify. So can you really reduce it down to a neat accountant's ledger? Not to say that we shouldn't strive for clear thinking on policy matters. Of course, that is something that we all should do and do. So here's a bit of another way of looking at it. Positivism is, you're a genius. I know what I know. And post-positivism is, I think that there is a category of that, and that is a construct created by other people. So in thinking about policy, there has been quite a lot of work under the post-positivist idea. So starting with Lindblom, for example, in 1959, policy change can be seen as incremental, a muddling through. And then we heard from a lot of kind of many narratives type approach. So you might understand policy by listening to someone talk about it. You might follow what they say and the words that they use in order to understand policy. And there is also a critical realist concepts where reality is independent of our thinking, but we need to understand the limitations of the methods we use in order to judge whether that reality is as real as we think it is. And lastly, constructivists who have kind of moved post-positivism, if you like. Our understanding of reality is based on perceptions of reality. So we're getting really into the post-truth era here. So an example of post-positivist understanding is Downes' issue attention cycle. 1972. Downes uses the term cycle, but he didn't illustrate the concept. So this was someone else's interpretation of what Downes was talking about. If you think of it, the cycle is more like a wave, and it has stages. So there's a pre-problem stage, a discovery enthusiasm stage, realization of costs, decline of interest, and post-problem. So he's clearly articulating a post-positivist understanding that all of those things are affected by prominence on the left-hand side. So the degree of prominence affects the stages of policy making. It's not something that just exists in reality on its own, which is judged. So while Downes focuses more on public attention rather than government attention, it's generally expected that government policy interests will mirror public attention to some extent. And in the pre-problem stage, government identifies the problem as one that should be targeted for intervention. Discovery is when work is done to address the problem, including policy analysis and decision making, and realisation of costs is implementation. Decline of interest is monitoring, evaluation, and then the problem's fixed. So this is the garbage can model, and this is all about to understand processes within organisations. One can view a choice opportunity, i.e. a policy decision, as a garbage can into which various kinds of problems and solutions are dumped by participants as they are generated, and the mix of garbage in a can depends on the mix of cans available, on the labels attached to alternative cans, on what garbage is currently being produced, and on the speed with which garbage is collected and removed from the scene. And this work actually came out of studying the way that universities made decisions, which I think is pretty funny. And academics assume this model also applies to public policy, although I haven't seen anyone try and apply the specifics of the model. It actually is, apart from the headline, a little more complex. If you read the actual paper, they talk about something called net energy load access arrays, energy distribution in government decision making. And there are some aspects though that seem to shine through. Policy decisions are made when problems and solutions are generated by practitioners and considered in various forums. Forums might be task force, working groups, formal policy making forums like cabinet. And the policies being produced depends on those forums, the scope of those forums, the efficiency at which they make those decisions, and the people that are involved. And what this idea tells us is that the garbage can model tells us is that policy making is messy, chaotic, and has an element of randomness. It combines problems and solutions and participants, and that all of those factors matter in the outcomes of and the decisions that are made. There's also a time element and a relativity element. We can use it in understanding the mix of how decisions get made. For example, National Cabinet has just come together this year. That's a new forum. It has the First Ministers attending and the Prime Minister. It's creating a different mix of policy decisions than the predecessor COAG. Okay, the next one I wanted to talk through is multiple streams. So if you're feeling a little unsatisfied with the garbage can, it's all just a bit too messy for you, you might like Kingdom's multiple streams, and this might help you with some other understanding. So Kingdom developed this model to describe policy making done by in the US Congress, so a little bit different to our system in New South Wales. Policy can be made when problem, policy and politics come together. And originally this was known as 3 streams and is now known as multiple streams when a 4th stream was added. The problem stream, which the 4th stream was the political stream. So the problem stream is issues, crisis, attention. It's perceptions of the problem and assessments of whether government action is needed. The policy stream is the solutions developed by experts who examine problems. It could be public servants, but it also could be external lobbyists or stakeholder groups. And the political stream is factors that influence at the political level, national mood, advocacy campaigns, perhaps elections, and Kingdom doesn't include politicians in that category of politics, which I think is always a bit odd. And windows are points in time in which streams come together, and this is triggered by a focusing event like a crisis or institutionalised event like an election, and the actions of policy entrepreneurs who work within or external to government to agitate for change. Kingdom coined the phrase the primeval policy soup when of mixing issues, ideas, solutions and actors. So if nothing else, Kingdom's language of policy windows, policy entrepreneurs, streams have really been influential, and along with the concept that these must line up for policy to be possible. But this kind of familiarity also makes the theory seem a little bit dated or simplistic, and some of what is included in the policy and political stream don't quite translate comfortably to our context. The policy stream, for example, could be broadened to include the options that are technically possible. It could include trends in acceptable policy instruments. It's unclear where ministers or cabinet sit within the framework, and it also doesn't quite acknowledge how the definition of the problem in the first place can be a political process, which was something that Colback pointed out. And what of implementation? Where does that fit? It's nowhere to be seen. But we can apply this concept of the policy window to think about what is the timing at which policy making becomes possible. So this concept of multiple streams has now been updated into the 5-stream confluence model. If you found some of those, that the more simplistic approach a little bit unsatisfactory, this was produced by Howlett, McConnell and Pearl in 2014, so much more recent. Still got the idea of streams and windows and points at which kind of decisions are made. And it also recognises implementation. So I'm not going to go through that, but I think you'll get the idea. I particularly like the whirlpools in the middle. So the next idea is punctuated equilibrium from Baumgartner and Jones, 1991, and was developed. Their ideas were developed over quite a long period of time, and they're still writing on this idea and developing it. It was spawned, and it actually was so kind of influential, it spawned a whole movement, starting with the Comparative Agendas Project, which now has been franchised across the globe, and with the goal of establishing a more systematic study of policy. So under punctuated equilibrium theory, decision makers are unable to react proportionately to moderate changes in the environment. They ignore problems until a surfeit of information accumulates to produce a spike or burst in political policy activity, and there's a change in policy patterns. It was used to identify changes in US agency budgets, and they could see from looking at the budgets and that there were changes in the dynamics of policy making. Policy change is quite disjointed, it's episodic, it's not predictable, but major policy changes create ripples through the system without the need for top-down direction, according to Jones and Baumgartner. This is really a contrast against the standard model of policy change, for example, based on elections, where policy change is caused by the preferences of elected policymakers, which is, I guess, the essence of democratic accountability. And what Jones and Baumgartner are saying is, but what about the policy change between elections? That's the problem with that standard model of understanding the relationship between democracy and policy. And as we know, a lot of policy making actually happens between elections. And there's also no role for prioritisation of policy issues. How do shifts in priorities, are they just reflective of the belief of government of the day, or do they reflect the specific issues that they face? Political decision makers are receiving information all the time that helps them process and focus attention from interest groups, from public opinion surveys, for example. How do those decision makers choose what to focus on? Jones and Baumgartner also included terminology like stick-slip dynamics, which is borrowed from plate tectonics, to describe the under or over adjusting to the flow of information, and problem prioritisation appears stable because of the resistance to change, and sometimes problems fester below the radar until a crisis erupts, resulting in disjointed policy responses. So how to apply this type of understanding? We can get comfortable with the idea that policy is disjointed, episodic, not predictable. This concept of slip and stick might help with problem prioritisation. How do we get things on the agenda? When are they coming onto the agenda or not? There's a stickiness in not wanting to address issues and then suddenly it slips on. So my further development of this is that policy making is a complex kind of wave pattern. It's kind of an adaptation also of Downes' issue attention cycle, locating this wave-like concept of policy where interest in policy making varies over time on the horizontal axis, and policy activity meaning the number of policies made. So we begin with an initiating event, such as a crisis, new scientific information, entrepreneurs making connection with policymakers, the competition of ideas arising from belief systems of policy elites who have the ear of government or the ear of the media. And this transforms into a condition or a problem suitable for policy intervention, suggested by Stone, 1989, and policy activity really becomes highly energised by increased knowledge and awareness, including the success of entrepreneurs, response from other actors, effective policy venues, expansion of the scope to cover unrelated areas, complexity, and future crises. So this is creates really a positive feedback loop. Created, can also involve the creation of agencies that are specifically focused on an idea, and also, some to the extreme that the policy work extends to become a negative policy bubble. This was described by Moore in 2016. The issue has become kind of sticky, but also peaks, and there's a backlash. So we get this type of pattern. We can observe this type of pattern in New South Wales policy making. It did occur in relation to, for example, climate change through the late 1990s through to 2010. So there is also kind of a relationship between, so I've presented a number of different kind of patterns of policy making, but we can also like look at them in terms of the relationship between those different patterns. Issue and attention can control the nature and outcome of conflict, as suggested by Cobb and Elder in 1972. As I said, I've largely presented different understandings of policy making as competing models, but it's possible that they are just different phases of policy making which change depending on the context. So as wickedness, for example, increases, wickedness meaning problems that are difficult to solve, incomplete, contradictory, have changing requirements, difficult to define. Stuart Weeks and Turnpenny are some authors who have written about wicked problems. Solving really kind of this idea of wickedness requires an integrated and very collaborative approach to policy with committed and unified stakeholders and efforts inside and outside of government, as suggested by Colbatch. But wickedness is not always inherent or static quality of a policy problem. There can be degrees of wickedness, as suggested by Head and Alford, 2013, and the wickedness of a policy problem can be altered by the context of the issue and the way that it's framed, and alternatively through its causal story, suggested by Stone, 1989. Salience is how important the issue is to a stakeholder, and that can also change. For example, prior to the 2007 Australian federal election, climate change was highly salient in the New South Wales community, and really that was kind of a reaction to the Howard Coalition government's refusal to ratify the Kyoto Protocol at the national level. And after the protocol was ratified by the Rudd Labor government, the salience of climate change really declined, and so that shows you how something can seem really important, and in fact decision makers' policies can influence that salience. So the relationships can work both ways, and what this means as policymakers is that by changing the pattern of decision making and redefining how we understand a policy problem, and perhaps doing something about it, we can actually change the way that policy is made. If we're not comfortable with this punctuated equilibrium, we want a more rational approach, then making a few decisions may reduce the salience, and we may be able to get into a more kind of steady as you go field. But for complex problems, wicked problems, you might not just be able to kind of sum up the costs and benefits. If the issue is very complex, you may need to make small decisions incrementally in order to address it. Right. So the next model I want to talk through is the Advocacy Coalition Framework. So Sabatier, 1991, said this idealised image of policy making is rarely encountered in the real world, where there are powerful political agents, ideology, turbulence and complexity. So the main points of this, and I know there's a lot on this slide, is that policy is influenced by stable parameters and more changeable parameters, events. Opportunity for change is influenced by long-term factors, degree of consensus, openness of political system to change, and the ability of actors to influence, given short-term constraints. Policy decisions come about as a result of competing narratives between advocacy coalitions, the success of which is dependent on policy beliefs and their resources and the strategies that they apply. Decisions lead to implementation, which could include rules, allocation of resources, appointment of people into key roles, and implementation creates policy outputs. I'm over here on the right-hand side of the slide, and those policy outputs create impacts, which then feeds back into to further work and to the success of the advocacy coalitions. So there is a learning element to this understanding of policy development under the advocacy coalition framework. This has also got its own set of terminology. We're talking about policy subsystems. Policy subsystems are a primary unit of analysis to understand a policy process, and they have a unique geographic area. Issues and policy actors. Coalitions may be formal or informal, but they do share core beliefs. Actors may be members of the advocacy coalitions. They can also sit outside of them and be brokers, entrepreneurs, and they may play a leadership role. And there are venues, courts, parliament, agency, decision-making forums, collaborative institutions. And there's a little bit of venue shopping between the advocacy coalitions to decide which venues that are most suitable for achieving their outcomes. So the strengths of this model are that it's an alternative to some of the more static understandings of policy. The authors say it's better because it has a clear causal, the assumptions are clear, it's empirically tested, they've tested this quite a lot on real world examples. There's an explicit role for information and the way the information flows through the system. It's also kind of comparing with institutional analysis and the development framework, which is another model developed kind of at the same time. It recognises that institutions foster collective action. Also highlights magnitude and nature of political conflicts. It's not driven by institutional association of the actors, but of hundreds of actors attempting to influence policy. It doesn't assume researchers, policy analysts, scientists, or policy practitioners like yourself are neutral players, but that scientific and technical information has a significant role to play. And it's applicable to many contexts, countries and issues. So I think they really love this one, and you can go to conferences on it if you want to, but there are some problems with it. It can be a little bit difficult to apply, it's complex. It requires a lot of assessment about, you know, who is performing which role. Are they an advocacy coalition, or are they an entrepreneur, or are they merely a consequence of all of that happening around them? It doesn't also tell us, the main issue for me is that it doesn't tell us much about how government weighs up choices and makes decisions. They say rather general things like research has shown that there are indeed changes in policy, major or minor, and that there's certain factors that lead to policy change. However, the process of understanding is complex because policy change is not the result of one event alone, rather a combination of diverse dynamics that occur in one process over time. So it doesn't really kind of, you know, when you're in the middle of this, if you're a decision maker or you're involved in supporting a decision maker, how do you really know how to weigh up and make decisions? It's just kind of presented as government will make a decision. So as I said, this has been applied quite a bit, and I'll give the example that the authors themselves, Wiebel and Sabatier, have applied the advocacy coalition framework to Lake Tahoe water quality issues. So the ACF framework has been applied in at least 80 applications over 20 years, and we can see that it kind of works. So based on the ACF, I've mapped this. So on the left-hand side, you've got the relatively stable parameters. Lake Tahoe is a deep and clear lake. The dispute of land, around the lake is ongoing. That is as a result of property rights and environmental values, governance is fragmented. So all of those are relatively stable parameters. The external parameter that they're saying is that at the same time that these stable things are happening, there's been a growth in the environmental movement. And that leads into the growth of scientific information, which feeds in. And so then on the right-hand side, you can see two coalitions identified. The Development Coalition, who believe in pro-development, they believe in legal authority, public opinion information, and they have mobilisable troops, people, developers, landholders that are interested in their a way of understanding the world, and they've also got financial resources and leadership. On the other side, there is the Water Quality Coalition. They believe in conservation. They also believe in legal authority, public opinion. They have mobilisable troops, and they have financial resources and leadership. So they're the resources that they kind of have available to them. And both of those coalitions pitch their collective resources against each other and find venues that that can make decisions in their favour. Then you know, and in this case, it came down to court cases and a judgment, which is actually in this example, the judgment was unfavourable to both sides, and this policy entrepreneur Bill Morgan played a really pivotal role in realising that there were two competing coalitions, that they were both unhappy. He developed an understanding that there was what was called a hurting stalemate that was no good for anyone, and he went back to both of them and was able to craft a solution that was more acceptable. And as a result, they reached a truce or a policy position that allowed a balance between the competing coalitions. And that was based on that. What he actually did, if you're interested in the detail, is he was an executive director of a regional planning agency. He was trusted by both coalitions, knowledgeable about the problem. He was in a position of authority. He brokered a compromise involving a new land evaluation system, some lot acquisition programs, rights for all property owners to build eventually, housing allocation system programs for transferable development rights. And apparently that compromise is still in effect today. So this advocacy coalition framework is quite good in a post-truth world. It highlights the role of representation in agenda setting, where advocacy coalitions made up of individual actors construct and frame the agenda to influence the scope and outcomes of policy development through various mechanisms, public inquiries, using the media, stakeholders, evoking expertise and research, establishing their narratives as objective truths when they are also political constructions. And these competing representations determine the course of policy development and policy outcomes, reflecting the discourse that they're applying. So pretty useful for our current understandings of policy. So just to finish up now, key takeaways. We have to acknowledge there are different stages of policy making, and that they have different roles and they're all important. We should attempt to make clear statements in precise quantitative terms to promote clear thinking. We know that policy can be disjointed and episodic and not predictable, but we should be aware of how stable factors, but opportunities for change, resources and constraints of actors, brokers, strategies and learning all influence policy making. I don't know about you, but I've spent a lot of time making bread this year, none as beautiful as these pictures, but shaping a policy really is, you know, you can start with the same materials, but you can get quite different outcomes. So framing of policy issues and relationships between actors and activities really shape the decisions and implementation, and in the end, the results. Problems, solutions, people and forums matter, even if policy making can be messy and chaotic. Use policy windows when policy problems politics and program come together. And we might want to think about how we can make a problem more or less sticky to help with prioritisation or agenda setting. The degree of salience and wickedness can change the pattern of policy making, and we can use those factors to help with the end goal. And then finally, you can be Bill Morgan. You can be one of those respected leaders who understand the detail and have great relationships and can see a way through. So we are now at the questions and answer bit, and I'm going to take my slide down so I can see you and you can see me. What I would like you to do now is, if you have a question, please stick up your hand and we will unmute you, and you should make sure you're unmuted from your side as well. And you can ask a question or you can make a comment. So I'll just give a few moments for you to think about your question. And I think, hang on, I can't quite see you now. Right, we have a question from Kate. Kate, can you try speaking to us now?
Okay, thanks, Louisa, for a really great presentation. My question is about one of your last comments about how we can try and reduce the stickiness involved in policy problems. And I'm just wondering if you can give an example, any recent examples of where you think that's been achieved. I'm in the EPA, so I'd be interested in the environment space, but any policy area really.
Yes, so I'm going to give a forestry example because it's a really well-known example, and because it kind of happened quite a long time ago, it's really easy to get perspective on it. I think it's harder to get these types of perspectives when you're closer in the mix of things. But you might remember in the 1970s and 1980s in New South Wales with forestry policy, it was a huge conflicts. Environment movement was actively protesting at forestry sites, and you know, there were physical kind of clashes with loggers. They were, you know, chaining themselves to trees, and very passionate about needing to protect old growth and native forests. As a result of the changes, really the changes in government, with Bob Carr taking this as one of his core beliefs, they made a lot of incremental decisions about forestry policy through the IFOAs, and that resulted in a lot of creation of new national parks. And incrementally, they really changed the nature of that debate, and over time the kind of environmentalists were won over. They did still guarantee some levels of supply as well for the forestry industry, although it declined massively as a result of structural change, but there was some support provided for transition of the industry. So you can kind of see that by the incremental decisions that are being made, the stickiness of that issue subsides. If we're not making any decisions, if we just left it there, you know, environmentalists would still feel terrible about forest areas being logged, and loggers would still be, you know, physically clashing. The policy issue would be kind of stuck on the agenda if we were unable to make decisions. So that's kind of an example of how incremental change, incremental policy decisions to move areas from forest management into national parks has allowed stickiness to be reduced, become more slippery. It's reduced, the salience is reduced, and the wickedness has also reduced at the same time. So keep the questions coming. I'm going to try and give quite short answers if I can. I can't see any yet, but don't forget to kind of stick up your hand if you do have a question. know we did get some questions from earlier in the year, actually, because we ran this up earlier. There's some questions about, well, this is all very good from academic perspective, but what about the real world? And don't practitioners have more understanding of really what's going on than academics? And I don't not disagree with that. We did hear from a range of other speakers on the practice of policy and how they think about policy. So do check out that one, in particular Peter Shergold's presentation and Joanne Wilkie are probably the ones that really stick in my mind. Now we have a question from Eloise. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, Eloise?
Thanks, Louisa. I just wondered whether, to the extent that policy results in regulatory change, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about how these views on policy frameworks fit with better regulation requirements and, sort of ideas around regulatory stewardship. Have you given any thought to that, the sort of framework that New South Wales has in terms of better regs and any move that agencies might have towards regulatory stewardship? Have you given that thought in terms of the conclusions you've drawn?
Yeah. So look, I think what I didn't touch on today, and I might do another time, is this concept of instruments, policy. I would call them policy instruments. Regulation is one form of a policy instrument, and there are a bunch of other types of things you can use. So you can use education, you could use the creative governance arrangements, you can use market sort of techniques, creation of markets. The EPA, I think, has a long history in experimenting with different forms of policy instruments, as an example. So the concept of best practice regulation, I think, is really ensuring that the regulations that we make are as beneficial as possible. So what is the impact that we're having? How simple is it for people who are affected by the regulated community? How easy is it for them to apply and comply with the rules? So really our understandings of kind of best practice regulation are quite they're well developed. It's very kind of a positivist type of approach. We know what regulation should be, and we can adjust it, and we're in control. We can do cost benefit analysis to work out whether it's a good idea or not. We might get some other speakers. I know that there's work in Department of Customer Service and Treasury as well on best practice regulation, still ongoing after many years, as I'm sure you're aware. We might get some other speakers to come in and talk about where that work is up to specifically.
Great, thank you.
Oh, I've just seen the time. We're actually up for time. I just wanted to thank you all for coming in and listening today. I actually do have some more questions and answers that I might circulate to you all, and we do have a feedback form which we'll also circulate too. So I really, I'll have to bring it to a close, but thank you so much for joining us today. We'll also, if you're not a member of the New South Wales Policy Professionals, please sign up, and you'll get emails from us with the links to the other webinars from earlier this year, and you'll also get notice of our program for next year. It should be a good one. We're looking at having a range of speakers, including academics and case studies, and really kind of addressing a range of topics. And if you've got a topic would like to present, just contact me. or through the New South Wales policy professionals, and we'll see if we can get a slot for you for next year. All right, well, thank you very much, and have a good day.